Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in today's episode, we will be discussing all things watercolor. And it's actually pretty interesting how I came up with the idea for this week's episode, and it actually pertains to my own artistic pursuits. So currently I'm working on a watercolor painting in which I'm employing a plethora of different styles and techniques of watercolor, and this really got me thinking about all the different ways there are to make watercolor paintings. So for this reason, I thought I would share with y'all the unique ways you are able to create watercolor pieces using your own skills. So without further ado, let's get into the information. The first technique I will be discussing is what is known as the wet on wet style, which falls under the overarching category of wet wash watercolor painting. To do this style, you pretty much just follow the name and begin by wetting the paper, and the brush shortly follows. Once both the paper and the brush are coated heavily with water, you will want to dip into your pigment and spread the color onto the paper. You will notice that this technique will create a diffused design as the paint will spread through the water you have coated onto the sheet. Similar to the aforementioned technique, there is also the wet on dry method, which falls under the general category of dry wash color painting. This is also quite self-explanatory and involves one, wetting the brush, dipping into the watercolor paint, and subsequently applying the wet brush and paint to a dry paper. This will produce a much different effect and will allow the painter to have more control over the dispersion of the pigment. Moving on to the more stylistic techniques that truly add depth and character to one's painting, there is what is known as gradient building and color blending. Simple watercolor washes use just one color, but in order to add more variety to a piece, you can add more hues via a gradient. To begin, start by adding watercolor to a wet paint surface using the wet on wet technique we already discussed. Next, place a second color, either a deeper hue of the original color or an entirely new hue next to the original color. Due to the nature of the paint on a wet surface, it will begin to blend ever so slightly and produce a gradient in the two tones used. To control how clean or messy the gradient turns out, simply just add or adjust the amount of water you put onto the paper. The more water, the generally more messy the gradient will come out. The next technique to create stylized watercolor pieces is known as a dry brush painting. This style is for those of y'all who want to create a painting that looks almost scraped in texture. So to begin, you will start by putting very little water onto your brush and dipping into the pigment. Next, you will wipe off any excess water from the brush onto a paper towel, and just remember that this is pivotal because this is what truly distinguishes the look of dry brushing from wet on dry watercolor painting. Lastly, you will take the brush and drag it lightly over the paper to create the textured effect that highlights the consistency of the paper. The last technique we will be discussing today is one you might not necessarily expect if you have not heard of it already. There is no technical name for this style, but it pretty much involves salt on a wet wash. Because the salt on wet paper gathers the pigments within watercolor, it is able to produce a really sick textured effect. The effect varies on the size of the salt grains, as well as the amount of water placed on the paper. Therefore, it is advised that one experiments with salt on a separate scrap piece of watercolor paper before diving into their final piece. After placing the salt on the watercolor, wait for the piece to dry, and then just brush off the leftover salt grains. Well, I hope y'all learned a little bit about some of the many watercolor techniques and styles there are. Please let me know if you try any of these in your own pieces. As for always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.